In the small, rainy town of Maple Grove, Claire Bennett leads a quiet life as a school librarian, her days filled with books and the gentle rhythm of solitude. But everything changes one stormy evening when she meets Matthew, a pale, withdrawn boy standing alone in front of a neighbor's rundown house. Something about the child's silence, his guarded eyes, and the unsettling tension in his home sparks a concern Claire can't ignore. As she watches Matthew's struggles with neglect and fear, Claire is drawn into his world, wrestling with her own doubts about how far she should go to help. Her initial acts of kindness, a warm meal, a safe space at the library, soon turn into a deeper commitment, as Matthew begins to trust her and reveal the painful truths about his life. But the challenges escalate when Claire is forced to intervene, calling the authorities in a desperate bid to protect him. What follows is a journey of love and resilience as Claire steps into an unfamiliar role, becoming Matthew's guardian and fighting to give him the stability and care he's never known. Along the way, both Claire and Matthew face their own fears and insecurities, forging a bond that will change their lives forever. Will Claire's efforts be enough to help Matthew heal? Can she overcome the obstacles of a flawed system and prove that love and determination can create a family from even the most broken pieces? Claire Bennett lived a quiet life in the small, rainy town of Maple Grove, nestled in the heart of Oregon. Her days revolved around the familiar routine of her job as the local middle school librarian, her evenings spent curled up with her aging tabby cat, Willow, and her nights occasionally interrupted by the hum of passing rain on her tin roof. Her life wasn't exciting, but it was steady, and Claire took comfort in the predictability of it all. Her home reflected her personality, tidy, warm, and unassuming. The small, one-story bungalow had a weathered charm, with ivy climbing up the brick walls and flower beds that Claire tended to each weekend. Books were scattered throughout the house, and the faint scent of lavender always lingered, thanks to her collection of candles. Claire liked her solitude, but often felt a nagging emptiness, as though she was waiting for something or someone to give her life more meaning. On an uncharacteristically blustery Thursday evening, Claire was returning from work when she noticed a boy standing in front of the dilapidated house across the street. The house belonged to the Millers, a family she had rarely seen despite living in the neighborhood for years. The boy was around 9 or 10, his frame thin and hunched as he clutched a backpack to his chest. Rain pelted down relentlessly, and the boy seemed to hesitate, his hand hovering near the doorbell. Something about the scene made Claire pause. She parked her car and sat for a moment, watching the boy through her windshield. The storm pressed on, and the boy didn't move. Finally, Claire grabbed the spare umbrella from the back seat and stepped out into the rain. "Hey there," she called out, raising her voice above the wind. The boy startled and turned toward her, his wide brown eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his oversized hoodie clung to his slight frame. "You're going to get soaked out here," Claire said gently, holding out the umbrella. He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer and taking it with a quiet "thank you." Claire crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "Do you live here?" He nodded but didn't offer any more information. She noticed his hands were trembling, whether from cold or fear. She wasn't sure. "Do you need help getting inside?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "No, I'm okay," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. He turned toward the door and pressed the bell. Claire lingered for a moment, unsure if she should leave. The door creaked open, and a tall man with unkempt hair and a sour expression appeared. His eyes flicked between Claire and the boy, his face hardening. "Who's this?" the man barked. "No one," the boy said quickly, stepping inside. "She just gave me an umbrella." The man grunted, shooting Claire a glare before slamming the door shut. The sound echoed in the rain, leaving Claire standing alone on the porch with a growing sense of unease. That night, as she curled up with Willow on the couch, Claire couldn't shake the image of the boy. He had looked so out of place, so vulnerable. The man's hostility had unnerved her, and the boy's reluctance to speak had only deepened her concern. She stared at the flickering candlelight, her mind racing with questions. "Am I overthinking this?" she murmured to Willow, who responded with a half-hearted purr. "Still," Something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Claire had always trusted her instincts, and tonight, they were telling her that something was not right in the Miller household. The next day, as Claire shelved books at the library, her thoughts kept drifting back to the boy. She replayed their brief encounter, analyzing every detail. She didn't even know his name, but the memory of his trembling hands and quiet voice lingered like a shadow. During her lunch break, Claire found herself gazing out the window at the rain-soaked town square. She debated whether to talk to someone about what she had seen, but who would she tell? And what could she say without sounding intrusive or paranoid? Her coworker, Sarah Mitchell, interrupted her thoughts by plopping down at the break room table with a sandwich and a Diet Coke. "You're awfully quiet today," Sarah said, raising an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" Claire hesitated, unsure how to put her feelings into words. Finally, she decided to share. "I met this boy yesterday," she began. "He lives across the street from me. He seemed, I don't know, troubled." Sarah frowned. "Troubled how?" Claire described the encounter, from the boy's hesitation to the man's curt demeanor. Sarah listened intently, her brow furrowing. "It sounds like something's off," Sarah agreed. "But it's hard to know for sure from just one interaction." "I know," Claire said, sighing. "But I can't stop thinking about him. He just seems so lost," Sarah offered. Claire nodded. "Well," Sarah said, leaning back in her chair, "maybe keep an eye out. If you see more signs that something's wrong, you could consider talking to someone about it. A teacher, maybe, or even child services." Claire nodded, though the thought of acting still made her uneasy. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she resolved to stay alert. That evening, as Claire pulled into her driveway, her gaze drifted to the Miller house. The boy was there again, this time sitting on the front steps with his backpack at his feet. The rain had stopped, but the air was cold, and he hugged his knees to his chest as though trying to stay warm. Claire hesitated before getting out of the car. She considered walking over, but what would she say? She didn't want to scare him, or worse, draw attention from his father. Instead, she went inside and rummaged through her pantry. She found a thermos and poured in some of the soup she had made the night before. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the street, trying to appear casual. "Hi again," she said as she approached. The boy looked up, his expression wary but not unkind. "I brought you some soup," Claire said, holding out the thermos. For a moment, the boy didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire smiled, sitting down on the step beside him. She didn't ask any questions this time, sensing that he needed space. Instead, she looked out at the street, letting the silence settle comfortably between them. After a few moments, the boy spoke. "My name's Matthew." Claire turned to him, her smile widening. "It's nice to meet you, Matthew. I'm Claire." Matthew nodded, his grip tightening on the thermos. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know." Claire's heart ached at the resignation in his voice. "I know," she said gently. "But I want to." Matthew didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile flickered across his face. For the first time, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. Claire found herself watching for Matthew every day after their brief exchange on the steps. Something about him lingered in her mind, a mix of quiet strength and fragility that she couldn't shake. Each time she saw him at the Miller house, he seemed smaller, as if the weight of his world were pressing him into the ground. Saturday morning arrived with its usual routine. Claire brewed a cup of coffee, watered her plants, and sat at the bay window to read. Her book, however, lay forgotten on the table as she spotted Matthew walking along the sidewalk, his head down and his backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, his thin frame stooped under an invisible weight. Claire considered calling out to him, but stopped herself. She didn't want to push too hard, too soon. Instead, she resolved to go about her day and see if he returned. By late afternoon, the boy was back. This time, he sat on the curb near the edge of the driveway, poking at the gravel with a stick. Claire watched from her kitchen window, torn between giving him space and offering some kind of comfort. Taking a deep breath, she opened her front door and stepped outside. "Matthew," she called softly. He turned, surprised but not startled, and gave her a small wave. Claire walked over, holding 2 mugs of cocoa. "It's getting chilly," she said, handing him one. Matthew took the mug and wrapped his hands around it, though he didn't take a sip. "Thanks," he murmured. Claire sat beside him on the curb, her own mug warming her hands. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the faint hum of cars in the distance the only sound. "Do you like school?" Claire asked gently, keeping her tone casual. Matthew shrugged. "It's okay. Do you have a favorite subject?" Another shrug. "Art, I guess." Claire perked up at that. "Art's wonderful. Do you like to draw?" Matthew hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes. I'm not very good, though." "I doubt that," Claire said with a small smile. "Everyone has their own way of creating. I'd love to see something you've made someday." Matthew didn't respond, but his posture relaxed slightly. They sat for a while longer, sipping cocoa as the sky turned orange with the setting sun. Claire wanted to ask more about his family, his home, his life, but she held back. She could sense how guarded he was, like a turtle retreating into its shell at the slightest disturbance. Over the next week, Claire began noticing things she hadn't before. Matthew's clothes were often the same, his sneakers scuffed and too small for his feet. She saw him at the bus stop some mornings, standing apart from the other kids, his head down as if trying to disappear. At work, Claire was shelving books when she noticed a crumpled piece of paper left on one of the tables. She smoothed it out, revealing a rough pencil drawing. The image stopped her in her tracks, a dark, jagged house with a single small window glowing faintly. Her stomach turned as she studied it. The details were rough, but haunting the house seemed alive, its sharp edges clawing at the sky. And yet, the glowing window gave it a strange, fragile hope. "Matthew," Claire whispered to herself, certain the drawing was his. She slipped the paper into her bag, resolving to bring it up the next time they spoke. That Friday, as Claire arrived home from work, she spotted Matthew sitting on his steps again. This time, he looked paler than usual, his head resting on his knees. Claire's worry surged, and without thinking, she crossed the street. "Matthew," she said softly as she approached. He looked up, startled, and quickly wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "Hi," he said, his voice shaky. Claire knelt in front of him, her heart tightening at the sight of his red-rimmed eyes. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said quickly, but his trembling hands betrayed him. "Matthew, it's okay to tell me if something's wrong," Claire said gently. He shook his head, his lips pressed tightly together. Claire sat beside him, unsure how to proceed, but unwilling to leave him like this. After a few moments, she reached into her bag and pulled out the drawing. "Is this yours?" she asked, holding it out. Matthew froze, his eyes darting to the paper. Slowly, he nodded. "It's beautiful," Claire said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. He blinked in surprise. "Really? Really," she assured him. "It's so expressive. You have a gift, Matthew." For the first time, a flicker of pride crossed his face, though it quickly faded. "It's just a drawing," he muttered. "Maybe," Claire said, "but it tells a story. I'd love to know what inspired it." Matthew hesitated, then sighed. "It's just how things feel sometimes. Like everything's dark, but there's this one small light, and you have to hold on to it." Claire's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to hug him, to promise him that things would get better, but she knew he wasn't ready for that kind of closeness. "You have a lot of light in you, Matthew," she said softly. "I can see it." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and hope. "You don't even know me." "Maybe not yet," Claire admitted. "But I'd like to, and I'm here if you ever need someone to talk to." Matthew didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. For Claire, that felt like a small victory. That evening, Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at the drawing. She couldn't shake the feeling that Matthew's words had been more than just a description of his art. They were a glimpse into his world. A world filled with shadows, but not without hope. Her conversation with Sarah replayed in her mind. If you see more signs that something's wrong, you could consider talking to someone about it. But who? And what would she say? Claire sighed, running a hand through her hair. She didn't want to make assumptions or act prematurely, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency in her heart. Matthew needed someone. Whether it was her or someone else, she wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. she couldn't just walk away. As the rain began to fall outside, Claire made a quiet vow to herself. She would keep reaching out, step by step, until Matthew knew he wasn't alone. Little did she know, her small acts of kindness would soon ripple outward in ways she could never have imagined. The weekend passed slowly for Claire, her mind consumed by thoughts of Matthew. His drawing, his guarded demeanor, and the raw emotion in his words weighed heavily on her. She spent Sunday tending to her garden, hoping the methodical work would bring her some clarity. But as the hours ticked by, her concern only grew stronger. On Monday morning, Claire noticed Matthew at the bus stop as she left for work. He stood apart from the other children, his head bowed, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pocket. The sight tugged at her heart, but she forced herself to keep driving. She needed to respect his boundaries and let him come to her in his own time, or so she told herself. By the time she arrived at the library, Claire had resolved to keep her interactions with Matthew light for now. She had no authority in his life, no real connection beyond a few conversations. Pushing too hard could drive him away. That afternoon, the school day ended, and the library filled with the familiar sounds of students chatting, shuffling books, and clicking keyboards. Claire was shelving a row of fantasy novels when she spotted Matthew slipping through the door. He moved like a shadow, unnoticed by his peers, and headed for the far corner of the library. Claire's first instinct was to approach him, but she hesitated, choosing instead to watch from a distance. He pulled out a notebook and began sketching, his head low, his pencil moving with quick, deliberate strokes. After a few minutes, Claire grabbed a book at random and walked toward his table, feigning casual interest. "Hi, Matthew," she said gently. He startled slightly, but didn't look up. "Hi," he mumbled. "Is it okay if I sit here?" Matthew shrugged, which Claire took as permission. She set the book down and pretended to read, sneaking glances at his notebook. The page was filled with intricate sketches of tiny, cluttered rooms dioramas, she realized. Each one was more detailed than the last, with miniature furniture, windows, and doors. "These are incredible," she said softly. Matthew froze, his pencil hovering over the page. "They're just ideas," he muttered. "They look like more than just ideas to me," Claire said. "Do you build them too?" Matthew hesitated before nodding. "Sometimes, if I can find the stuff I need." Claire smiled, feeling a surge of admiration for him. "I'd love to see one sometime." He didn't respond, but Claire noticed his shoulders relax slightly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the soft scratch of his pencil against the paper. The next day, Claire was locking up the library when she spotted Matthew sitting on the steps outside. His backpack was beside him, and his head rested on his knees. "Matthew," she said, approaching him, "is everything okay?" He looked up, his eyes red and puffy. "I missed the bus," he said quietly. Claire frowned, glancing at the clock. It was already past 5. "Do you want me to walk you home?" Matthew hesitated, then shook his head. "It's fine. I'll just wait until my dad gets me." Claire's concern deepened. "How long have you been waiting?" "A while," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Claire sat beside him, her worry growing. She didn't want to pry, but something about his tone told her that his father might not be coming. "Matthew," she said gently, "if you need a ride, I'm happy to take you." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," Claire said with a small smile. "But I want to. Let me help." "Okay." After a long pause, Matthew nodded. The ride was quiet, Matthew staring out the window as Claire drove. She tried to make small talk, asking him about school and his favorite books, but his answers were short and hesitant. When they reached his house, he muttered a quiet thanks and slipped out of the car. Claire watched as he approached the front door. It was several moments before he opened it, stepping inside without turning back. The door closed with a hollow thud, leaving Claire with a sinking feeling in her chest. That evening, Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at her untouched dinner. She couldn't stop replaying the day in her mind. Matthew's puffy eyes, his reluctance to talk about his family, the way he lingered at the library steps. She didn't want to overstep, but her instincts told her that something wasn't right. She thought about Sarah's advice, take small steps. Maybe there was a way to help without pushing too hard. The next day, Claire stopped by a craft store after work. She wandered the aisles, picking up miniature supplies. Tiny furniture, bits of wood, paint, and glue. She didn't know if Matthew would accept them, but it was worth a try. On Thursday, Claire waited until Matthew arrived at the library before approaching him with the bag of supplies. "I found these at a craft store," she said, setting the bag on the table. "I thought you might be able to use them for your dioramas." Matthew stared at the bag, his eyes wide. "You bought these for me?" Claire shrugged, trying to downplay her gesture. "I just thought they might be fun to use." For a moment, Matthew didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached for the bag, pulling out a tiny chair and turning it over in his hands. "Thanks," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Claire smiled. "You're welcome." Over the next week, Matthew began spending more time at the library. He brought his sketches and supplies, working quietly in the corner while Claire went about her duties. Occasionally, he would show her his progress, his shy pride shining through as he explained the details of his creations. Claire noticed a change in him, subtle but significant. He seemed less guarded, more willing to talk. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for Claire, it was enough. The library began to feel like a safe haven for Matthew. Each afternoon, he claimed his usual corner table, spreading out his materials with a quiet focus that warmed Claire's heart. She tried not to hover, giving him the space to create, but she couldn't help glancing his way from time to time. His dioramas were incredible, tiny, intricate worlds that seemed to grow brighter and more detailed with each passing day. One particular afternoon, Claire was sorting returned books when Sarah approached, holding a steaming cup of tea. "Your little artist is here again," Sarah said, nodding toward Matthew's corner. Claire smiled, watching him carefully glue tiny wooden beams into place. "He's really talented." Sarah studied Claire for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've been spending a lot of time with him." Claire hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I'm just trying to be there for him. He doesn't talk about it much, but I don't think things are great at home." Sarah frowned, setting her tea down on the counter. "Do you think he's in danger?" "I don't know," Claire admitted. "It's more a feeling than anything else. He's so guarded, and there's this sadness about him that breaks my heart." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "I can see why you're worried. But you can't do it all on your own, Claire. Maybe there's a way to get the community involved without it being obvious." "What do you mean?" Claire asked. "Well," Sarah began, "what if we organize something here at the library? An art exhibit or a craft workshop? It could be a way to support Matthew while also giving other kids a creative outlet." Claire's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea, and it might give him a little confidence, too." The next morning, Claire brought the idea to the library's director, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Langley. She was immediately supportive, offering to provide funds for supplies and advertising. Within days, posters for the Young Creator Showcase were displayed throughout Maple Grove, inviting children to share their artwork and crafts in a public exhibit. Claire kept the details casual when mentioning it to Matthew, not wanting to pressure him. "You know, if you wanted to share one of your dioramas, I think a lot of people would really enjoy seeing your work," she said one afternoon. Matthew looked up from his sketch pad, his expression skeptical. "I don't know," he said. "What if people don't like it?" "I think they will," Claire said gently. "But if you're not ready, that's okay too." He didn't respond, but she noticed him working with more determination in the days leading up to the showcase. The night of the event, the library was transformed into a vibrant gallery, filled with colorful paintings, sculptures, and crafts created by local children. Families milled about, admiring the displays and chatting excitedly. Matthew arrived late, carrying a carefully wrapped box. Claire met him at the door, her heart swelling with pride. "Do you need help setting up?" she asked. Matthew shook his head, holding the box tightly. "I've got it." He made his way to an empty table near the back and began arranging his dioramas. Claire watched as he worked, his movements precise and deliberate. When he finished, the tiny scenes looked magical under the soft glow of the library lights. As the evening went on, more and more people gravitated toward Matthew's table. Children marveled at the miniature worlds he had created, while parents praised his attention to detail. "This is amazing," one woman said, leaning in for a closer look. "How did you make these?" another asked. Matthew's cheeks flushed, and he mumbled a quiet explanation about the materials he used. Claire stayed nearby, offering gentle encouragement whenever he seemed overwhelmed. By the end of the night, Matthew had a small crowd gathered around him, all admiring his work. Claire couldn't remember the last time she had seen him smile so freely. Later, as they cleaned up the library, Matthew approached Claire with a shy smile. "Thanks for helping me," he said. Claire knelt to his level, her voice soft. "You did all the hard work, Matthew. I'm so proud of you." For the first time, he didn't look away or shrug off her praise. "Do you think we could do this again sometime?" Claire's heart ached with warmth. "I think we could make that happen." The success of the showcase sparked something in the community. Inspired by the event, several parents volunteered to lead weekly craft workshops at the library, creating a space where children could explore their creativity. Matthew became a regular participant, slowly building friendships with the other kids. One afternoon, Sarah stopped by Claire's desk with a broad grin. "Did you hear about the Bennett effect?" she teased. Claire laughed, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You've got half the town rallying around these kids," Sarah said. "It's amazing to see." Claire shook her head, blushing. "It's not me. It's them. They just needed a little nudge." But for all the progress Matthew was making, Claire couldn't ignore the underlying worry that still lingered. She rarely saw his father, and when she did, his presence was always accompanied by a sharp tension that made her stomach churn. One evening, after a particularly lively craft workshop, Matthew lingered as the other children left. He seemed distracted, his usual focus replaced by a nervous energy. "Matthew," Claire said gently, "is everything okay?" He hesitated, looking down at his hands. "My dad gets mad sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire's chest tightened. "Does he hurt you?" Matthew didn't answer, but the fear in his eyes said enough. That night, Claire lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind raced with questions and doubts. She had done what she could to support Matthew, but was it enough? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she saw a text from Sarah. "You're doing great, Claire. Just keep being there for him." The simple message brought tears to Claire's eyes. She couldn't solve everything, but she could be a steady presence in Matthew's life. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to make a difference. The warm glow of the Young Creators Showcase lingered in Claire's mind as one of the most hopeful nights she'd experienced in a long time. Seeing Matthew beam with quiet pride as others admired his work had been a rare glimpse into the boy he could be confident, capable, and full of promise. But the unease she'd felt when he mentioned his father's temper hadn't left her. It gnawed at her, a dull ache that grew sharper with each passing day. The following week brought a biting chill to Maple Grove, the kind that made people hurry between warm places and pull their coats tighter. Claire had spent her lunch break checking in with Sarah, trying to untangle her thoughts about Matthew's situation. "You can't save the world," Sarah had said gently, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. "But you can keep doing what you're doing. Be a safe place for him. Sometimes that's more than enough." Claire had nodded, but as she drove home that evening, the doubt lingered. Was she doing enough? Her answer came sooner than she expected. It was a Wednesday night when she heard the shouting. Claire had just settled on the couch with a book when the muffled sound of raised voices drifted through her living room window. She froze, straining to hear. The noise was faint, but unmistakable angry yelling punctuated by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor. The Millers. Heart pounding, Claire rushed to the window. She couldn't see much through the darkness, but the sounds continued sharp and chaotic, sending a shiver down her spine. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and dialed Sarah. "Claire? What's going on?" Sarah's voice was groggy, but instantly alert. "It's the Millers," Claire whispered. "They're shouting, crashing. Something's wrong." There was a pause. Then Sarah's calm voice returned. "Call 911. Now. They'll know how to handle it." Claire hesitated, her hand trembling. "But what if I'm overreacting? What if—" "Claire," Sarah interrupted firmly. "This isn't about you. It's about Matthew. Call them." Claire swallowed hard, nodding to herself. "Okay." She hung up and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she described the situation to the dispatcher. They assured her an officer would be sent to check on the house. But as she hung up, Claire felt her stomach twist with guilt and anxiety. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, the shouting had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its place. Claire watched from her window as two officers approached the miller's door. They knocked, and after a tense moment, the door creaked open. Claire's heart ached as she saw Matthew standing there, his small frame silhouetted in the doorway. The officer spoke to him briefly before stepping inside. Time seemed to stretch as Claire waited, pacing her living room and glancing at the clock. Finally, the officers emerged with Matthew in tow. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. The officers walked him to their patrol car, speaking to him softly as they opened the door. Claire watched, her chest tightening as he climbed in without protest. The next day, Claire learned that Matthew had been taken into temporary protective custody. She received the news from Mrs. Langley, who had heard it through a connection at the school. Claire felt a mixture of relief and guilt. She knew she had done the right thing, but the thought of Matthew alone in a foster home, scared and uncertain, made her heart ache. "I should have done more," Claire confided to Sarah later that day. "You did what you could," Sarah reassured her. "You might have saved him from something worse. Don't lose sight of that." That weekend, Claire couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. The house across the street was silent now, its windows dark and unwelcoming. On Saturday morning, she received a call from a woman who introduced herself as Rebecca, a social worker assigned to Matthew's case. "Matthew mentioned you," Rebecca said. "He told me you've been helping him at the library." Claire felt a lump in her throat. "How is he?" "He's adjusting," Rebecca said gently. "It's always hard at first, but he's in a safe place now. He's asked if he could see you, though. Would you be open to visiting him?" "Yes," Claire said immediately. "Of course." The visit took place at a small foster home on the edge of town. Rebecca greeted Claire at the door, leading her into a cozy living room where Matthew sat on the couch, his knees pulled to his chest. "Matthew," Rebecca said softly, "Claire's here to see you." He looked up, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and vulnerability. Claire smiled, sitting beside him. "Hey, kiddo," she said gently. "Hi," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. For a while, they just talked about books, dioramas, and the library. Matthew seemed hesitant at first, but as the conversation flowed, he began to relax. "I was scared," he admitted quietly. "When the police came." "I know," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. "But they were there to help you, to make sure you were safe." Matthew nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's better here," he said after a moment. "I'm glad," Claire said, reaching out to touch his hand. "And I'll keep coming to visit. You're not alone in this." For the first time since she'd arrived, Matthew smiled a small, fleeting expression, but one filled with gratitude. That night, as Claire drove home, she felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead for Matthew would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, she felt confident that he would find his way, and she would be there to help him every step of the way. The quiet of Claire's house felt heavier than usual after her visit with Matthew. Though she was relieved he was safe, the empty spot across the street, a home that should have offered him comfort, reminded her of how much he had lost. She sat at her kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring a mug of tea. Willow curled up on the chair beside her, purring softly. The house felt too still, too ordinary, as though the world had moved on while Matthew's life remained in chaos. Claire had promised to visit him regularly, but the thought of stepping into his fragile new reality made her nervous. Would he retreat again? Would he see her as just another adult who would eventually walk away? The following week, Claire drove to the foster home for her second visit. This time, she brought a small gift, a new sketchbook and a set of colored pencils. As she parked in front of the modest two-story house, she noticed how neatly kept it was, with flower boxes lining the windows and a small wooden swing on the porch. Rebecca greeted her warmly at the door. "He's been looking forward to seeing you," she said, her smile reassuring. Claire followed Rebecca into the living room, where Matthew was sitting cross-legged on the rug, fiddling with a model car. When he looked up and saw Claire, a flicker of relief crossed his face. "Hi, Matthew," Claire said, kneeling beside him. "Hi," he replied softly. "I brought you something," she said, handing him the wrapped sketchbook. Matthew hesitated, his eyes widening slightly as he unwrapped the gift. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Claire said. You can use it to draw, or write, or whatever you feel like. It's yours." A small, shy smile crept onto his face. "Thanks," he murmured. They spent the next hour talking quietly. Matthew seemed more relaxed this time, his words coming a little easier. He showed Claire the few drawings he had made on scraps of paper Rebecca had given him, and she praised his work with genuine enthusiasm. "It's nice here," he admitted after a while. "It's quiet. They have dinner at the table every night." Claire felt a lump in her throat. For Matthew, something as simple as a shared meal felt extraordinary. "I'm glad," she said softly. As the weeks passed, Claire became a constant presence in Matthew's life. She visited every few days, sometimes bringing books or small craft supplies, sometimes just sitting with him while he worked on his dioramas. Little by little, Matthew began to open up about his past, not in dramatic revelations, but in small, quiet moments that Claire learned to cherish. "My dad wasn't always like that," he said one evening as they sat on the porch swing. "He used to take me fishing. We'd catch these tiny little fish, and he'd say they were the best ones because they tried the hardest." Claire smiled, sensing the mix of fondness and hurt in his voice. "But then he started drinking more," Matthew continued, his tone quieter now. "And he'd get mad about everything. Sometimes he'd just leave for days, and I didn't know if he was coming back." Claire's heart ached for him, but she didn't interrupt. She knew the best thing she could do was listen. Matthew's progress wasn't without its setbacks. Some days he seemed withdrawn, barely speaking more than a few words. On others, he clung to Claire's presence, as though she were the only solid thing in his life. One particularly difficult evening, Claire arrived to find Matthew sitting on the steps of the foster home, his head buried in his arms. "Hey," she said gently, sitting beside him. "What's going on?" He didn't answer at first, his shoulders trembling. Finally, he looked up, tears streaming down his face. "They're going to send me somewhere else, aren't they?" he said, his voice breaking. Claire's chest tightened. "What makes you think that?" "They always do," Matthew said bitterly. "Nobody keeps me. They just pass me around." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat, struggling to find the right words. "Matthew, I can't promise I know what's going to happen, but I can promise you this. I'm not going anywhere. No matter what, I'll be here for you." For a long moment, Matthew didn't respond. Then, slowly, he leaned against her, his small frame trembling with quiet sobs. Claire wrapped an arm around him, her own tears threatening to fall. The next day, Claire reached out to Rebecca. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. "We're still assessing his long-term placement," Rebecca said. "His parents are facing neglect charges, and it's unlikely he'll return to their care. But permanent placement takes time." Claire hesitated before speaking. What if I could help?" Rebecca's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You mean as a temporary guardian?" Claire nodded, her heart pounding. "I care about him. I've been in his life this long. I can't imagine walking away now." Rebecca's expression softened. "It's a big commitment, Claire. You'd have to go through the necessary screenings and training, and it's not a guarantee. But if you're serious, I can help you start the process." "I'm serious," Claire said, her voice firm despite the fear bubbling inside her. "Whatever it takes." That evening, as Claire sat in her living room, she thought about how much her life had changed in the past few months. Before Matthew, her days had been predictable, even comfortable. But now, every decision felt weightier, every moment more meaningful. Willow jumped onto her lap, purring softly as Claire stroked her fur. "We're really doing this," she whispered to the cat, a mix of determination and uncertainty in her voice. In her heart, Claire knew she had already made the choice. The decision to pursue temporary guardianship weighed heavily on Claire, but with each passing day, she became more certain it was the right choice. Matthew had already become such an integral part of her life, more than just a child she cared about. He was someone she wanted to protect, nurture, and see flourish. The process began almost immediately after Claire spoke with Rebecca. The social worker walked her through the necessary steps: background checks, home inspections, and mandatory training sessions. The list was daunting, but Claire approached each task with quiet determination. One Saturday morning, as she scrubbed her already clean baseboards in preparation for the home visit, Sarah dropped by with coffee and a bag of muffins. "You've gone full mom mode," Sarah teased, setting the bag on the counter. Claire laughed, wiping her hands on a towel. "I just want everything to be perfect. What if they walk in and think I'm not good enough?" Sarah gave her a firm look. "Claire, you're more than good enough. You're already doing so much for Matthew. They'll see that." Claire sighed, sitting down at the kitchen table. "I hope so. He's been through so much, Sarah. I just want to give him a chance to feel safe, to feel like he belongs somewhere." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "And that's exactly why you're going to be great at this. You care. That's what matters." Matthew had been told about the possibility of moving in with Claire, but he was cautious. During one of her visits, he fiddled with a small wooden figure from one of his dioramas, his brows furrowed. "What if it doesn't work out?" he asked quietly. Claire's heart ached at the fear in his voice. "Matthew, I can't promise everything will be perfect, but I can promise that I'll do everything I can to make this your home. You'll always have a place with me." He didn't respond immediately, but when he looked up, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. As the weeks passed, Claire began to notice the ripple effects of her efforts to help Matthew. The craft workshops at the library had become a popular community event, with parents and kids alike joining in each week. One evening, after a particularly lively session, one of the parents, a man named Jim, approached Claire. "I just wanted to say thank you," Jim said, his voice earnest. "My daughter loves coming here, and honestly, it's been good for me too. I never thought I'd be sitting at a table gluing popsicle sticks with a bunch of kids, but here we are." Claire laughed, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I'm glad it's been helpful. It's amazing what a little creativity can do." "It's more than that," Jim said. "You've built something special here. You've given these kids a place to feel seen. That's not small." Claire's cheeks flushed, and she thanked him, but the words stuck with her. She had been so focused on helping Matthew that she hadn't realized how far-reaching her efforts had become. Meanwhile, Matthew's progress continued, albeit with occasional setbacks. Some days, he seemed almost carefree, sketching new ideas for his dioramas and chatting easily with Claire. On others, the weight of his past seemed to pull him down, leaving him quiet and withdrawn. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Matthew hesitated before speaking. "Do you think my dad ever thinks about me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Claire set her book aside, her chest tightening. "I think he does," she said carefully. "But sometimes people have their own struggles, and they don't know how to be the parents their kids need." Matthew nodded slowly, staring at his hands. "I just wish things could have been different." "I know," Claire said gently. "But it's okay to feel that way, and it's okay to want something better for yourself, too." As the day of the final home inspection approached, Claire felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Matthew had been spending more time at her house during the evenings, and the space had already begun to feel like it belonged to both of them. One evening, while preparing dinner, Claire heard Matthew's soft footsteps behind her. "Can I help?" he asked, surprising her. "Of course," Claire said, smiling. She handed him a cutting board and a knife, showing him how to chop vegetables for the soup. They worked side by side in companionable silence, the soft clatter of the knife against the board filling the kitchen. "You're a natural," Claire said as Matthew carefully added the chopped carrots to the pot. He gave her a small, proud smile. "I never really cooked before." "Well, we'll have to make it a regular thing," Claire said. "You can be my sous chef." Matthew's smile widened, and for a moment, Claire saw a glimpse of the carefree boy he could become. The home inspection went smoothly, much to Claire's relief. Rebecca had been right. Her efforts to create a safe, welcoming environment for Matthew had not gone unnoticed. As the final paperwork began to move forward, Claire allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She thought about how much her life had changed since meeting Matthew. Her once predictable days had become filled with new challenges, but also new purpose. And through it all, she had discovered something she hadn't known she was missing: a deep sense of connection and love. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Matthew spoke up unexpectedly. "Do you really want me to stay?" he asked, his voice filled with both hope and uncertainty. Claire turned to him, her eyes soft. "Matthew, I don't just want you to stay. I want this to be your home, your real home. For a long moment, Matthew didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he leaned against her, resting his head on her shoulder. "Okay," he whispered. Claire wrapped an arm around him, her heart swelling with emotion. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but in that moment, she felt a quiet certainty that they could face it together. The air in Claire's house felt different now, warmer somehow. Matthew had begun staying with her on a temporary basis while the guardianship process moved forward. At first, the arrangement felt fragile, like a bird's nest in a storm. But little by little, they found a rhythm. Mornings were filled with the clatter of cereal bowls and rushed conversations about school. Evenings brought quieter moments, homework at the dining table, movie nights on the couch, and of course, Matthew's endless sketching. The house, once so still, now hummed with life. One afternoon, Claire picked Matthew up from school. He climbed into the car with a deep sigh, tossing his backpack into the back seat. "Long day?" Claire asked, glancing at him. Matthew shrugged. "Some kids were making fun of me during art class." Claire's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What happened?" "They said my diorama was dumb," Matthew said, his voice quiet but tinged with hurt. "That I spend too much time on stuff nobody cares about." Claire's heart ached. "Matthew, your work is amazing. Anyone who says otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about." He gave a small, doubtful shrug, staring out the window. "You know," Claire continued, "when I was your age, I used to write stories. I'd spend hours making up these little worlds and filling notebooks with ideas. But I never showed anyone because I was afraid they'd laugh." "Did they?" Matthew asked, looking at her. Claire smiled softly. "Some did, but the ones who mattered encouraged me. And you know what? Their words meant more than anyone else's." Matthew nodded, the weight in his expression lifting slightly. "Maybe I'll show you my new one when I finish." "I'd love that," Claire said, her heart warming. That evening, while Matthew worked on his diorama at the kitchen table, Claire received a call from Rebecca. "I wanted to let you know that the final review for temporary guardianship has been approved," Rebecca said. "Matthew will officially be placed in your care as of next week." Claire's breath caught. "That's wonderful news." "Thank you, Rebecca." Rebecca's tone softened. "You're doing a great thing, Claire. He's lucky to have you." Claire glanced at Matthew, hunched over his work, completely absorbed in the tiny world he was building. "I think I'm the lucky one," she said. The following weekend, Claire decided to celebrate the milestone with a special outing. She and Matthew drove to a nearby state park, the car packed with sandwiches, snacks, and a picnic blanket. The park was quiet, the crisp autumn air filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. They hiked along a winding trail, Matthew clutching a small sketch pad as he stopped to draw trees, birds, and anything else that caught his eye. "Look at this one," he said, holding up a quick sketch of a twisted oak tree. Claire smiled. "That's incredible. You've really got an eye for detail." Matthew beamed, a rare expression of unguarded joy. They found a clearing by a stream and spread out the picnic blanket. As they ate, Matthew's mood grew reflective. "Do you think I'll ever see my dad again?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. Claire set down her sandwich, her chest tightening. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But if you do, I hope it's under better circumstances." Matthew nodded, staring at the stream. "I used to think it was my fault, that if I'd been better he wouldn't get so mad." Claire felt her heart break a little more. She reached over, placing a hand on his. "Matthew, none of this is your fault. Not a single bit of it. You deserve to be cared for, no matter what." Matthew didn't say anything, but the way he leaned slightly into her touch told her he had heard her. Back at home, Matthew surprised Claire by asking to frame one of his drawings. "I think it's my favorite," he said, holding up a detailed sketch of a cozy house surrounded by trees. Claire smiled. "It's beautiful. Let's hang it in the living room." They spent the evening choosing the perfect spot, finally settling on the wall above the couch. As Claire stepped back to admire it, she noticed the way Matthew looked at the drawing, pride flickering in his eyes. "It looks perfect," she said. Matthew nodded, his lips curving into a shy smile. "Thanks for letting me stay here." Claire crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Matthew, this is your home now. You don't have to thank me for that." That night, as Claire sat reading in the living room, She glanced up at the framed drawing. It wasn't just a picture, it was a symbol of how far Matthew had come and how much further they could go together. She thought about the challenges they had faced and the ones still to come. There would be hard days, no doubt, but they had already built something strong, something worth fighting for. Claire closed her book and leaned back, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in a long time, her house didn't feel like just hers. It felt like theirs. The days that followed Matthew's placement with Claire were filled with a sense of cautious optimism. Though the guardianship was temporary, their bond deepened in ways neither of them had expected. Claire found joy in the small routines they shared, packing Matthew's lunch, helping him with his homework, and hearing his stories about school. For Matthew, the stability was unfamiliar but comforting, like stepping into the warmth of a home he hadn't realized he'd been missing. One evening, Claire noticed Matthew standing in front of the framed drawing in the living room, his brow furrowed in thought. "Do you think it's good enough?" he asked as she walked in. Claire tilted her head, puzzled. "Good enough for what?" "For people to like it," Matthew said quietly. Claire knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "Matthew, the most important thing about your work is that you like it. When you create something, it's a part of you, and the right people will see how special it is." Matthew nodded, though his doubt lingered. That weekend, Claire took Matthew to a craft store to pick up supplies for a new diorama. She watched as he carefully selected tiny pieces of furniture, miniature trees, and sheets of colored paper. "What are you working on next?" Claire asked as they waited in line. Matthew hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I want to make a house. Like this one." Claire's heart swelled. "I can't wait to see it." The following week, Matthew's teacher, Mrs. Peterson, called Claire to share some good news. "Matthew gave a presentation in class today," she said. "He brought in one of his dioramas and explained how he made it. The other kids were fascinated." Claire's eyes widened. "Really? That's amazing." "It was," Mrs. Peterson said warmly. "I can see how much he's grown. He even talked about how you've been encouraging him. I thought you should know you're making a big difference in his life." As Claire hung up the phone, her chest filled with a mix of pride and gratitude. She had worried for so long about whether she was doing enough, but hearing about Matthew's progress reassured her that she was on the right path. That evening, she shared the news with Matthew over dinner. "I heard you gave a presentation in class today," she said with a smile. Matthew shrugged, but his cheeks flushed. "It wasn't a big deal." "It sounds like it was a big deal to your classmates," Claire said. "And it's a big deal to me. I'm so proud of you." Matthew looked down at his plate, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he murmured. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day, but it wasn't without its challenges. Some nights, Matthew still woke up crying from nightmares, his voice shaking as he called out for Claire. She would sit beside him, her presence steady and calm, until he fell back asleep. "You're safe here," she would remind him softly. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." During one of these nights, as she sat beside him in the dark, Matthew spoke in a trembling voice. "Do you think I'm going to stay here?" Claire's heart ached at the uncertainty in his question. "I hope so," she said, her voice firm. "I'm doing everything I can to make that happen." Matthew nodded, clutching the blanket tightly. "I want to stay. I don't want to go back." "You won't," Claire promised. "We'll figure it out together." As the weeks passed, Matthew's diorama of their home began to take shape. He worked on it in the evenings, carefully crafting tiny versions of the furniture, the kitchen, and even Willow curled up on the rug. One night, as they admired his progress, Claire asked, "What made you want to build this one?" Matthew hesitated, then said, "Because it feels like a real home. Like it's mine too." Claire blinked back tears, her chest tight with emotion. "It is yours, Matthew, for as long as you want it to be." Claire's resolve to make their arrangement permanent grew stronger with every moment they shared. She began looking into the legal process of adoption, reaching out to Rebecca for guidance. "You've already built the foundation," Rebecca told her. "The courts will want to see that you're committed to his long-term well-being, and you've shown that in spades. It won't be easy, but I believe you can do this." Claire nodded, the weight of the decision settling over her. It wasn't a question of whether she wanted to adopt Matthew. She already knew she did. The question was how to ensure he felt secure and loved throughout the process. One day, while they were walking through the park, Claire decided it was time to bring up the topic. "Matthew," she began, "I've been thinking about something important." He glanced at her, his expression curious. "How would you feel about staying here permanently?" she asked, her voice careful. "About making this your forever home?" Matthew stopped walking, his eyes wide. "You mean you'd adopt me?" Claire nodded, her heart racing. "Only if that's what you want. I want you to feel safe and loved here, always." For a moment, Matthew didn't say anything. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face. "I want that too," he said, his voice soft but steady. Claire crouched to his level, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll make it official. You're not just part of this house, Matthew. You're part of my family." Matthew's smile grew, and he surprised her by wrapping his arms around her in a tight hug. Claire held him close, her own tears falling freely. As they walked back home, Matthew's steps seemed lighter, his usual quietness replaced by an eager energy. For the first time, Claire felt a deep, unshakable certainty. They were going to be okay. Together, they were building a life filled with love, trust, and hope, and that was something no one could take away. The decision to adopt Matthew gave Claire a renewed sense of purpose. While the process was still in its early stages, it felt like the culmination of every small step they had taken together. Matthew, too, seemed lighter, more assured in his place in her life. For both of them, the idea of forever brought a hope they hadn't dared to imagine before. The first legal meeting about the adoption took place on a rainy Thursday morning. Claire had spent the previous night organizing every document Rebecca had asked for: her financial records, a home study summary, and her written statement about why she wanted to adopt Matthew. Matthew sat beside her in the small courthouse waiting room, fidgeting with the zipper on his jacket. "Are you nervous?" Claire asked gently. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "What if they say no?" Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. "We're going to give them every reason to say yes. And no matter what, you'll always have me. That won't change." Matthew gave her a small, hesitant smile. When their names were called, Claire took a deep breath and stood, offering Matthew her hand. He took it, his grip firm despite his nerves. The hearing was brief but formal. Claire answered questions about her financial stability, her ability to care for Matthew, and her plans for his future. Matthew, too, was asked if he felt comfortable living with Claire and whether he wanted to be adopted. "I do," he said, his voice clear and steady. The judge nodded, a kind expression softening her stern features. "We'll move forward with the process," she said. "It's clear you've built a strong foundation together." As they left the courthouse, Matthew exhaled deeply, as if releasing a weight he had carried for far too long. "You did great," Claire said, squeezing his hand. "So did you," he replied, a hint of pride in his voice. The following weeks were filled with anticipation and preparation. Claire focused on making the house feel even more like Matthew's home, letting him choose paint colors for his room and pick out decorations for the living room. One afternoon, as they painted his walls a soft green, Matthew asked, "Do you think I should add something to the diorama? The one of our houses?" Claire asked. He nodded, dipping his brush into the paint. "Maybe you could add something that makes it feel special to you," Claire suggested. Matthew thought for a moment, then smiled. "A light in the window." "A light?" Claire asked, curious. He nodded again. "So, no matter how far away you are, you know it's always home." Claire felt her chest tighten, tears threatening to form. "That's perfect," she said softly. The day the adoption was finalized was one of the happiest in Claire's life. She and Matthew dressed in their best clothes and returned to the courthouse, where the judge officially declared them a family. When the final papers were signed, Matthew turned to Claire with a smile so radiant it made her heart swell. "I'm really your son now," he said, his voice filled with awe. Claire knelt, her hands resting on his shoulders. "You've always been my son in my heart, Matthew. Today just makes it official." He hugged her tightly, and she held him close, overwhelmed by the depth of her love for him. That evening, they celebrated with a simple dinner at home. Claire made Matthew's favorite meal, macaroni and cheese with hot dogs, and they ate by candlelight, laughing about the judge's stern expression and the way Matthew had accidentally knocked over a stack of papers during the hearing. After dinner, Matthew retrieved the diorama of their house and carefully added a small light to one of the windows. Claire watched as he worked, her heart full. "It's perfect," she said when he finished. Matthew stepped back, admiring his work. "It feels real now," he said. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's more than real. It's home." Later that night, as Claire tucked Matthew into bed, he looked up at her with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think I'll ever stop feeling scared?" he asked. Claire sat beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I think it's okay to feel scared sometimes," she said. "But you're not alone anymore, Matthew. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." He nodded, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. "Thanks, Mom," he murmured. The word caught Claire by surprise, filling her with a quiet, profound joy. "Good night, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As she returned to the living room, Claire paused to look at the framed drawing on the wall and the diorama on the shelf. Both felt like tangible symbols of everything they had built together, a life filled with love, trust, and the promise of brighter days ahead. She turned off the lights, leaving only a small lamp glowing in the window. As she stood there, gazing out at the quiet street, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For Claire and Matthew, the journey had been long and filled with challenges. But in the end, they had found something extraordinary, a family created not by chance, but by choice. And in the soft glow of the light in the window, Claire knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. As Claire stood by the window, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the dark street outside, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The light was a quiet beacon of the life she and Matthew had built together, a life rooted in love, trust, and the promise of a brighter future. For Claire and Matthew, the journey had been long and filled with challenges. But in the end, they had found something extraordinary, a family created not by chance but by choice. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about resilience, love, and the power of kindness. Your support helps us share these heartfelt journeys with more people. And remember to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how this story inspired you. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, let's keep spreading light and hope in the world.